How did I become such a confessionalist? I found myself grappling with more questions than answers regarding the soteriology of many evangelicals, particularly among independent Baptists, the Bible Baptists. After joining this community in 2011, spending 2 years as a member, I dedicated a significant amount of time to researching and reading various sources in search of clarity. As a teenager of 16, I had been exposed to a wide range of material, including atheistic and agnostic writings, heretical teachings, and other texts that ultimately proved unhelpful. My inquiries were primarily focused on the theological commonalities shared by most evangelicals, which sometimes seemed reminiscent of reasoning patterns found in the Roman Catholic Church. One of my central questions was, is salvation universal? Although I did not dedicate all my time exclusively to seeking answers to that particular question, the process of inquiry led me to significant and valuable insights. It was through this question that I began a deeper exploration and learning from the scriptures. In 2013, I enrolled in a home church based Bible Institute where I discovered that the Bible Baptist Church, of which I was a member, adhered to a pseudo universalistic view of salvation. After graduating from the Bible Institute in 2019, I spent the following 5 years delving into church history, Bible history, the systematic theologies from both the liberal and conservative perspectives. My studies encompassed the creeds, the ecumenical councils, as well as confessions and articles of faith. I also invested time in researching topics that, though controversial, proved provided deeper understanding and insights into my theological inquiries. I decided to stop my broad study because it felt overwhelming and I committed myself to focusing solely on reading the scriptures. I applied biblical exegesis, a disciplined study and critical interpretation of the text to ensure that I avoided imposing my own ideas into the text. My goal was to let the text speak for itself. Years later, while engaging with people on the internet, I participated in a discussion about atonement. The prevailing view in that thread was universal atonement, and my comment, which contradicted this general consensus, led to an accusation of being Calvinistic or Reformed. At that time, I was not yet a confessionalist and had little to no understanding of Calvinism or Reformed theology. I was simply expressing what I had learned through disciplined study and biblical exegesis, yet I found myself labeled as a Calvinist or Reformed simply for presenting a different perspective based on my scriptural study. I decided to return to my studies, focusing on Reformed theology as it was the only theological perspective I had yet to explore. I had previously avoided it due to the negative views about Calvinisms expressed by my local church. While I had encountered the Reformation in church history, I had not deeply investigated it, largely because of the stereotypes perpetrated by one-sided narratives from various Christian denominations and non-denominational groups that vehemently oppose Reformed theology. Upon studying Reformed theology, I realized that I did not need to alter my perspective or change my doctrine. I was already aligned with Reformed beliefs even before I formally studied them. I adhered to the articles of faith upheld by our Baptist predecessors, including the 1689 Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, the 1644 First London Baptist Confession of Faith, the 1658 Savoy Declaration, and even the 1646 Westminster Confession of Faith. However, I remain neutral on the chapter 28 of the 1646 Westminster Confession of Faith. I would like to provide my case during my tenure in Bible Baptist Church Santa Cruz. I have provided concentrated studies for a select group of young people, namely Princess, Claire, Cassie, and Patricia. This study focuses on biblical exegesis, which involves the critical explanation and interpretation of text from the Holy Scriptures. Although the structured study sessions began in late 2022, I had already been conducting informal discipleship study sessions with Princess and Clarence, who are my cousins, since late 2019 after bringing them to church. As a former youth Sunday school teacher and youth director, I previously used only the materials provided by the pastor and had not taught using my own resources. As a young person myself, I was particularly interested in the technical aspect of theology. Some of the young people in my current class share this interest. Although my pursuit of learning was driven by personal curiosity and effort, when the church study materials were unclear, lacking explanation, or provided inadequate answers, students often turned to me with questions. Only the most engaged and interested students sought further clarification, but Princess Patricia, Claire, and Cassie, despite my efforts to answer their questions within the constraints of the provided materials, these resources often fell short. Having experienced similar limitations, I understood their challenges and did not withhold the knowledge I had, recognizing their genuine interest in learning. I introduced to them exegesis of scriptural passages that the church had not extensively covered. I chose not to delve into Reformed theology as I felt it was unnecessary for them to adopt my confessionalist perspective. In late 2023 and early 2024, John, Chris, Kent, Maria, Cien, and Rochella developed an interest in the studies that the initial four were engaged in, eventually growing more invested. While John Clement showed less enthusiasm, he was still willing to engage with simpler topics within his understanding. I am confident in saying that Patricia, Princess Claire, and Cassie are the most active and involved young people in the church. Their engagement is significantly supported by their growing knowledge, with the main goal of the studying being to acquire a better understanding so you can do a better service to the Lord. They have exemplified this goal in practice, participating actively in almost all ministries, activities, and programs. In early 2024, the young people and I created a separate group chat for sharing topics, Bible content, and items related to the studies and activities. This group chat was distinct from the official Young People's Department chat to distinguish that these members were particularly interested in deeper study. Unlike the majority who were content with the materials provided by the pastor, for the most young people, this approach was satisfactory and it was not necessary for them to engage as deeply as we did. In early March 2024, we laid out plans for the year concerning young people's activities, goals, and preparations for anticipated changes, such as the graduation of senior high school students, moving on to college. During an open forum, we discussed the impending departure of key choir members, Ezra, Princess, Maria, Kent, and Rochelle, who would be going to college after graduation. Additionally, Claire, graduating this school year, would start her practicum next semester, which would also reduce the number of main voices in the choir. I requested their help in early March to invite and recruit younger teens to join the choir and ensure a smooth transition. We also plan to conduct children's ministry and extension classes in various locations such as Central, Magsaysay, although this plan failed due to scheduling issues. Bugas-Bugas, Batas, Payao, Anislagan Procdos. Despite challenges such as limited time, resources, and transportation issues, we made significant efforts to reach these areas with the support of young people who were committed to learning from my exegetical study sessions. In the second week of April, Leonardo joined us unexpectedly. Initially, I assumed he was hired by the pastor to assist with the ministry. Although his arrival seemed untimely, I accepted the pastor's decision to bring him on as an additional worker for the local church. Despite knowing Leonardo about 8 years prior at the church, his reasons for rejoining seemed unclear to me, but I chose not to question the pastor's decision. During our first discussion about the arrangement, The pastor mentioned, "Bung puli-puli ani mo ni Leonardo sa pagtudlo sa mga YP." He added, "Dungan ni siya nga worker sa church para makafocus na ka sa music department." And he concluded with, "Dili ni kompetensya." The conversation did not address whether there were plans to replace me from the youth directory, and no further discussions followed. If such a decision was made, I expected the pastor to inform the congregation, as this matter affects the whole church community. Since I received no official notice, I assumed there were no immediate plans to replace me, but I was prepared to step aside if necessary. However, I observed some unsettling developments. Despite my focus on the music department, there were no significant change in my ministry. Since the young people I have been working with in the YP department were the ones involved in the music department. But Leonardo took over almost all activities and weekly visitations for the YPs. Claire, Princess, and Cassie, who were already actively participating in the ministry and helping with teaching children, were also subjected to Leonardo's new discipleship sessions. I had been in the midst of discipleship sessions with these young people and had to pause them based on the pastor's directive. Given that Claire, Princess, and Cassie were already deeply involved in teaching, choir duties, and evangelism, it seemed more appropriate for Leonardo to focus on less active YPs who needed discipleship. His approach felt like a redundant reprogramming rather than addressing the real needs of the ministry. In May, many young people asked me when would I return to teaching in the youth department. I responded, maybe next time, since the pastor hasn't mentioned that it's my turn, because I believed we were merely taking turns. As I had been told, puli-puli lang mo sa pagtudlo sa mga young people. However, later that month, I learned from some of the young people that Leonardo had announced to the class that he was the new youth director and that I was no longer in the position. Initially, I found this hard to believe, and I thought it was ridiculous, as the pastor had not informed me of any such change. Leonardo's behavior further confirmed the young people's claims. He frequently stated, "Ako'y gidelegate ang authority, so kung naa may pangutana, at mo mangutana ni pastor." This confirmed that I have been replaced and removed from the directory without any prior notice or communication with the congregation. I was deeply angered and frustrated by this revelation, but felt powerless to take action. I had no authority to challenge the decision, and while I wanted to be informed and for the congregation to be notified, I had no means to address the issue effectively. This situation led to a growing antagonism towards their methods and teachings. Although I planned to leave, I chose to remain silent to avoid causing trouble, but I felt my integrity was compromised, stomped underfoot. The young people who had participated in my exegetical study sessions asked if I was okay with Leonardo. I said he was fine, although I was not. They then expressed their disappointment with Leonardo, describing him as insensitive, arrogant, and sycophantic. Rochelle, in particular, had a lot to say about Leonardo's behavior, especially regarding how he handled her recent loss. He reportedly made an insensitive comment about her boyfriend's death, which was a deeply personal issue for her. Without any sensitivity, Leonardo told Rochelle something along the lines of, "Maayo ra nga namatay to siya," referring to Rochelle's boyfriend who died of suicide, "kay para tanggalon sa Ginoo ang makakosog sala sa imong kinabuhi." Although I had not heard the exact word myself, but this is what Rochelle relayed to me. I mention Rochelle's case because it is significant, though it does not diminish the validity of our young people's concerns. I also expressed my displeasure with the decision, which further fueled to their dissatisfaction. They were particularly unhappy with Leonardo's appointment, given their disapproval of his character and leadership. While this discontent represents only a portion of the youth, it highlights a broader issue within the group. The concerns raised by the young people were primarily about Leonardo's character and the unprofessional nature of the pastor's decision. Their dissatisfaction was not rooted in theological disagreements, but rather in personal grievances with Leonardo's conduct and lack of proper communication. My personal grievance is theological. I find Leonardo's approach to teaching inept, lacking both clarity and depth. His frequent use of eisegesis, which means interpreting text based on personal biases, rather than exegesis, or interpreting text based on its original context, was so problematic. I observed him consistently distorting scripture to fit his narrative, confusing indicatives with imperatives, and failing to engage with the text meaningfully. Our conversation about pseudo-universalist theology revealed his inability to address critical questions, ending with vague statements like, "Sa eternity ra ta mag-abot." Later, Leonardo publicly presented arguments he had struggled with in our discussion, further demonstrating his disregard for proper exegesis. When I attempted to offer a correct exegesis of the text, Leonardo declined, asserting that my doctrine is wrong and that I didn't belong. He did not provide a standard for his claim, but rather dismissed my approach. His declaration, "You're in the wrong place," led me to believe that a private discussion with the pastor might have concluded that my theological perspective was incompatible with their views. Subsequently, Leonardo often used the pulpit to criticize me, labeling me with such terms as false prophet, false teachers, false doctrine. Despite these attacks, I chose to remain silent, maintaining my composure despite feeling deeply disrespected. During the CBY camp, I realized that my issues with Leonardo were not limited to theological differences. His character and behavior also became a significant concern. Although the situation is complex, I will highlight some key issues that stood out. Leonardo announced to the young people, that he was the new youth director and that the pastor had given him authority over the camp. The YPs even recorded a video of him confirming his new role and asserting that they should obey him rather than me. His repeated emphasis on "kay ako'y gihatagan ng authority" was unsettling. At this point, I had not been informed of my removal from the directory, nor had the congregation been notified. Well, that morning, Kent and Cien asked Leonardo about the camp location, and he responded with an attitude saying, "Si kiyobubong ninyo inyo pangutan-a." Because he knew Kent and Cien were more inclined to respect me than him, and his response demonstrated poor leadership. Despite their early arrival, the YPs were unable to access their rooms because Leonardo insisted they waited for accommodation. It took hours for them to wait. No one from the accommodation committee had checked on them. As a result, the YPs were left scorched in the heat of the sun. Upon my arrival, I quickly resolved the issue by checking with the committee and finding that rooms have been already prepared, but no one had inquired about them. This was indicative of poor leadership. Another issue at the camp was that the insufficient food supply. Anticipating this, I planned to return to Placer to get extra rice, borrow a rice cooker, and purchase canned goods to address the shortage. Feeling increasingly frustrated, I decided to return to Placer without informing Leonardo, as a way to subtly express my dissatisfaction with not being informed about my replacement. Leonardo demanded that I seek permission for every action, repeatedly asserting "kay ako'y gihatagan ng authority," but this constant reminder was frustrating. So I went back to Plaza with Kent, who helped me retrieve rice from his mother, and then we returned to the camp. Leonardo confronted me about not asking for permission, but he did not understand the underlying message of my actions. Despite my frustration, I resolved to comply with their authority for the remainder of the camp. Leonardo would occasionally check on the YPs, but he spent most of his time socializing with his old friends and rarely monitored the well-being of the YPs, such as ensuring they had enough food or water. He also spoke negatively about me to his pastor friends, which was apparent when those pastors displayed disapproval in my presence or would frown their faces when they see me. I overheard one of them say, "Mga badlungon ng mga YP sa badas tungod ni Bobong." indicating that Leonardo had likely made disparaging comments about me. The camp's theme was contending for the faith, warning against those who crept in unawares, referring to apostasy. Leonardo told Claire to be cautious of apostasy. Claire, be careful of apostasy, clearly implying me. Claire responded by saying, Bitaw you should be careful of apostasy. After this, Leonardo continued to socialize with his friends. I noticed a change in how the camp committee interacted with me after Leonardo's remarks. When I sought permission for food or other activities, the responses from the committee were delayed or unresponsive. I informed the young people that I would resign after the CBY camp. On the final day, Sister Juliet mentioned that her husband would come to pick up John Clement and John Chris that night, as they were too busy in the morning. I proposed that we split into two groups. One group would leave with Juliet's husband, and Leonardo's group would stay until the morning when Brother Pio Ilan would provide a ride home. We stayed at Maria's house since it was late, and there were no available tricycles. The following morning, Brother Pio picked up Leonardo's group and then stopped at Timamana to collect Patricia and Kylie. He informed the remaining group that he would return later to transport them home. But Leonardo instructed him not to. He said, ayaw na sila balika kay gawas naman na sa camp, gawas naman na sa church, stating that they were no longer the church's responsibility. Brother Pio was so offended by these words, and another disappointment was added, especially after learning from Patricia that I was no longer the youth director, as he, being a church member, had never heard of any such change. He insisted on taking everyone home, despite Leonardo's negligence, stating, Dili, ako na sila balikon hangtod di na sila makauli, responsibilidad nato na. Brother Pio also noticed that when he had brought food for us during the camp, the committee referred to the youth director as Leonardo rather than me. Para sa mga young people ni Leonardo, which surprised him. So after the CBY camp, the pastor called Leonardo and me for a conversation. I suspected that the camp's pastors had shared their observations with him. However, the pastor informed me that a parent had reported I was creating divisive groups during the camp and questioned why I wasn't cooperating or respecting Leonardo's leadership. I anticipated that this conversation would finally address my replacement from the youth directory, and I was prepared to accept it if that was the decision. However, the pastor did not mention anything about replacing me. Instead, the pastor commended Leonardo, saying, Pasalamat ka na naplastar ni Leonardo ang mga YP sa camp. While I digress, I disagreed with that state assessment, as I knew the camp had been chaotic until I intervened. Despite this, I chose to remain silent. The young people, who also noticed Leonardo's poor leadership during the camp, wanted to bring their concerns to the pastor. However, they were discouraged from doing so because it was clear that the pastor favored Leonardo's leadership. As a result, discussions about Leonardo became the focus of our group chat, which was initially intended for theological discussions. The GZ turned into a space for venting frustrations and discussing Leonardo's shortcomings. It was evident that the young people were frustrated with him, but the pastor was not a subject of criticism. I assured both the pastor and Leonardo that I would cooperate going forward. I decided to withdraw my resignation in hopes of encouraging the YPs to participate in the next camp, because they were initially disheartened and reluctant to join, but I managed to persuade them to participate. The following week, I conducted a summer music workshop, and I noticed a lack of enthusiasm and support from the pastor and his family compared to their previous support for Leonardo. During one music class, Ma'am being interrupted by turning off the lights while I was teaching, but I chose not to make a fuss about it. While I cooperated as expected, I also observed that Leonardo and his bunch were curious about my activities, particularly regarding my frequent phone use. They were intrigued by what I was doing on my phone. The GZ continued to be a place for sharing teas and Gen Z style jokes about Leonardo, although my focus remained on understanding the biblical context of the camp messages. I recognized that this group of YPs were more engaged in evaluating the teachings compared to other young people who often focus on the humorous elements of the sermons. The pastor's emphasis the pastor emphasized that none of my YPs were going forward during the altar invitations, which wasn't entirely accurate. They did go forward at times, but not consistently. During the second camp, Leonardo's group seemed overly interested in monitoring our conversations. They frequently glanced at my phone to see what I was typing, including Leonardo and Karen. Although I was willing to share if asked directly, but their behavior suggested that they would really want to see it for themselves. Thursday, July 11, 2024. My personal Facebook account was accessed without my permission. I am certain that Leonardo was responsible, not Mam Bibing, and I'm aware of how he managed to open my account. I can only imagine the pastor's anger after hearing about some of the content in our group chat. The issue came to light because I had commented on his Wednesday message criticizing his disapproval of my teaching. This was not the first time he had expressed dissatisfaction with my methods over the past 2 years. He has repeatedly suggested that I should not rely on visuals in my messages and has criticized my sophisticated articulation. John Chris first noticed that the pastor's sermon seemed to target me, and I began to be frustratingly worried, especially when he compared it to ravening wolves. This reminded me of what Leonardo had told Claire about those who had crept in unawares in the church, presumably referring to me due to my differing doctrines. In reality, it was simply a different perspective. John Chris brought this up in the GC, and I confirmed that I had noticed the same thing. We then discussed how such messages had become repetitive in their sermons, and it shared alternative perspectives on some passages used. They read the conversation after opening my account, and they translated it into gihimong katawanan si pastor, gikatawan si pastor kay balik-balik daw ang mensahe. There were haha reacts, but it was towards the joke they added later on, and not towards the pastor. There were several other topics in that GZ that they have completely misunderstood. I don't know how Leonardo related to them, but I suspect it has to do with his manner of reporting to the pastor. How were they able to access my account? The pastor claimed, nagpatudlo si Ma'am kang Leonardo sa katong bag-ong laptop. Tapos ni pop up ang account ni Bubong, gi-click mo tong na-open ang GZ. But this explanation is a blatant falsehood, clearly fabricated to obscure the fact that my personal account was improperly accessed. Firstly, I had never logged into their new laptop, so my account should not have been available on it. Secondly, I regularly clear my login history on all devices, making it impossible for them to access my account without using my email address. Any login attempt would have triggered a notification, which I did not receive. Thirdly, Facebook messages are protected by end-to-end encryption. Even if they somehow manage to access my account, they would still need my encryption code to read the messages. Only I know this code. Fourthly, our conversation in the GC ended on Wednesday night, making it technologically impossible for it to have appeared by Thursday noon. The real answer is that my cousin Princess has a personal laptop that I borrowed from my online classes. I left this laptop in the church office, logged into my Facebook account, and stored it in a bag. Leonardo must have invaded my personal property to access my account, a clear violation of privacy and a disregard for my right to keep personal information secure. It is evident that Leonardo was responsible, as Ma'am Bibing and the pastor lacked the technological expertise required to access my account. Leonardo not only read all the GC conversations, but also reported them, likely distorting their content to the pastor. When I offered the pastor a chance to review the GC conversations himself, to correct any misunderstandings, he declined. I am perplexed and frustrated by how the pastor chose to defend Leonardo with such an obvious and blatant lie. Friday, July 12, 2024. The next day, the pastor and I had a heated discussion about the matter. He was upset, believing that the GC discussions were highly offensive and that he was being mocked. He accused me of plotting to take over the church and reform it, misunderstanding what Reformed theology truly entails. I never intended to disrupt the church. This notion never even crossed my mind. I requested the opportunity to explain my side, but the pastor refused, saying, dili na kinahanglan. Ayaw na pag-explain, dili na kinahanglan. More than 40 years na ko sa ministry, kabalo na ko sa kamatuoran. He expressed that he was deeply hurt by the perceived laughter and gossip about him and his family in the GC. However, his family was never mentioned, except for a single instance involving Danny and a few references to Karen, which were all related to Leonardo. The GC discussions were primarily about Leonardo's leadership and character, not the pastor. I offered my phone to the pastor to review the GC conversations to clarify that he had misunderstood the comments, but he won't read it. Saturday, July 13, 2024. The following day, the wife is involved in that GC along with me apologized to the pastor and clarified that he was not the subject of jokes. They did not justify their actions, but acknowledged their role in the situation. Meanwhile, the pastor accused me of instigating rebellion and opposing his authority. I took full responsibility, though I maintain that it was not an act of rebellion or opposition. Despite having different perspective from the pastor, I have never intended to challenge his authority. During our conversation, Patricia expressed interest in learning Reformed theology from me, as it emphasizes biblical exegesis, which the group have found valuable. The pastor's reaction to this interest was negative, further straining the situation. He insisted on focusing heavily on the theological aspects, repeatedly emphasizing this point despite the fact that the young people's disappointments, particularly with Leonardo, was not primarily about theology. He pressed this issue to place all the blame on me, as if my sole contribution to the problem was my theological stance. They compounded this by highlighting various negative qualities of my character and personality, as well as my shortcomings during my ministry. They portrayed these issues as a unified manifestation of my supposed rebellion, claiming that I was uniquely rebellious in a way that no one else had been. During this time, I requested the opportunity to explain my position, particularly why I identify as a Confessionalist or a Reformed Baptist. Although I was allowed to speak, Ma'am Bibing continuously interrupted, preventing me from clearly articulating my views. The discussion frequently veered off topic, which hindered my ability to present a coherent argument. Bethel and Anjo also interjected, despite their limited understanding of theology. Frustrated, I eventually gave up trying to explain, recognizing that my efforts were unlikely to result any meaningful understanding. They accused me of having prejudice and being arrogant. But this description, they accused me of having prejudice and being arrogant, but this description more accurately applied to them. They dominated the conversation and rarely listened, dismissing my attempts to discuss theology with statements like, kabalo na mi, despite their lack of proper and consistent theological knowledge. Ma'am Bibing even challenged me with, unsay mong nabalaan nga wala pa nabalaan sa among pastor sa una. So we concluded that meeting with my resignation from preaching, and I committed to never speaking from the pulpit of Santa Cruz BBC again. They viewed my Reformed theology as fundamentally different and strange compared to their understanding. Although I had never preached anything from a Reformed perspective or used any Reformed terminologies in their pulpit, I also made it clear that they were not obligated to send me out if they did not wish to, for they considered me different from themselves. I reminded them of a previous disagreement, recalling an incident from about 5 years ago when I overheard Pastor Otis discussing about me with some young people. He had said, "Kung ako pa ana, dili na ako pag-graduaton si Bobong, dili man na takos." And added, "Ingon si Pastor, dili man na siya suportahan kung mag-mission na, kay magtukod man na og lain nga simbahan." At that time, I was not yet a Confessionalist or a Reformed Baptist, and am fully aligned with their theological perspective, yet they had already held such negative views about me. This history made me hesitant to request a formal send-out, so I sought a graceful exit. I felt increasingly alienated, as if I did not truly belong there. On Sunday, the pastor addressed the issue with the congregation as a blind item, expressing the stress it had caused him. The congregation rallied to comfort him. I expected the pastor to move on from this matter, since we had already forgiven each other. He had apologized for not informing me before deciding to remove me from the directory, and I had forgiven him in return. However, he continued to emphasize how hurt he was by the group chat, the alleged rebellion attributed to me. Although he had misunderstood the situation, I took full responsibility for the misunderstanding and any perceived offense. Regardless of whether he had forgiven me, ultimately only God knows. The following week, my group of young people planned a final sunrise prayer at Cagbantoy. Well, this activity was a tradition during my tenure, but it had ceased during Leonardo's ministry. We sought permission from the pastor and informed him of our plans. I explained to the group that it would be our last event, as I was preparing to exit, and I intended to train Basti and Noah to play the piano, so they could fill my role in the music department. I anticipated that it would take about 4 to 6 months for them to become proficient, so I planned to stay for that duration. On July 28, 2024, the pastor delivered a sermon aimed at refuting Calvinism, a segment of Reformed theology focused on soteriology. I anticipated he would employ a pseudo-universalistic approach to address Calvinism. I made a few notes on his misunderstanding of the subject and certain scriptural passages, but chose not to engage, even though he misrepresented Reformed soteriology. His approach seemed to mix elements of universalism, pseudo-universalism, semi-Pelagianism, revised Arminianism, and provisionism. I was indifferent to his approach and had no objections to him continuing to discuss this topic. After the service, I left my Facebook account logged in on the church's laptop, which I used for live streaming. I wanted to see who would attempt to access my account. My suspicion was correct. It was Leonardo. However, he found no additional comments about the pastor's sermon in our GC, since we had ceased discussing them. Leonardo may have anticipated comments due to the pastor's recent refutations of Calvinism, but there were none. On Sunday afternoon, Leonardo was scheduled to preach. I knew he would continue his refutation on Calvinism. Unfortunately, he relied on unreliable sources and strawman arguments against the doctrines of grace, failing to use credible Reformed theology references. His claims about understanding the context of the passages were misleading. For instance, he claims he misinterpreted John 6:37. The correct reading is, "All that the Father giveth me shall come to me," Jesus. This indicates that the Father's gift to the Son, or the Father's giving of people to the Son, precedes the coming of those people given to the Son. Leonardo, however, distorted this passage, saying, "Unsaon man sa Father paghatag og mga tawo sa anak, ang katong muduol, ang tanan nga muduol mo'y ihatag sa Father dito sa anak," which would be read as, "All those who come to me, the Father will give them to me." But this is a distortion. So this distortion misrepresents the original text, altering its meaning to fit a pseudo-universalist perspective. The congregation's enthusiastic agreement with Leonardo's statements and interpretation was so concerning. This misrepresentation is not an isolated incident. He frequently distorts context and meaning to support his views. This is when I decided to finally resign. I could no longer endure the weekly interactions with them, especially when I was continually labeled a fake and false teacher, despite their inability to pinpoint any specific errors in my teachings. Meanwhile, this twister of the word, Leonardo, was approved by the pastor as a suitable replacement for me. How could someone who distorts scripture be considered a valid teacher? I concluded that I no longer belonged there. On Wednesday, July 31, 2024, after a midweek prayer meeting, the pastor called me into his office for a discussion. During this discussion, my opportunity to speak was limited, as the pastor, Ma'am Bibing, and Leonardo dominated the whole time we talked. The pastor first asked me, "Unsa man imong decision, bong? Mo resign na ka?" To which I responded, "Oo, pastor, mo resign ako." The next opportunity to respond came when Leonardo interrupted, accusing me of discouraging my cousin Princess from attending worship at Karipunan Baptist Church. He said, "Pastor, iya na nang discourage si Princess nga dili mo simba sa Katipunan." I countered, dili na tinuod, pastor. Wala na sa among conversation. Kung dili man mo simba si Princess sa Katipunan, that was her initial decision nga wala na ko sugua. My third chance to speak arose when the pastor mentioned that an anonymous young person told him that I wanted to replace him and reform the church. He said, "Na young people sa church, dili nako panganlan. Nakadungog nga nagstorya ka sa una nga gusto kang mopuli diri sa Santa Cruz og imong i-reform ang church sa Santa Cruz." I replied, "Dili man tawo na tinod, pastor. Gi-clarify naman ako daan nga wala ko'y plano mamuli diri sa Santa Cruz. Og wala na ako na nastorya kay wala ko'y plano ngayong ana." I couldn't help but wonder where these baseless accusations were coming from. I had never plotted to take over Santa Cruz Church, nor did I intend to stay here indefinitely. I didn't want it to stay here that long. Although the pastor indicated that my departure wasn't initially planned, I reached to this decision because I could no longer tolerate the situation. From the pastor's decision to replace me without prior notice to being labeled a false teacher and a rebel just because of my theological perspectives, to having Leonardo, the twister of the word, preferred over me as a teacher, it all led me to realize that I no longer belonged there. I felt like a stranger in a place where I had once grown up. Later that night, the pastor removed me from the church's group chat. Shortly afterward, some church members contacted me privately to confirm whether I had indeed resigned. They informed me that the pastor had announced in the group chat that I have resigned from my position and my membership at the Santa Cruz BBC. I was astonished, as removing my membership was not part of our conversation and had never been a practice in the church's history. Even in cases of excommunication, the church had never removed someone's membership. This was unprecedented for the Santa Cruz BBC. I was left wondering what kind of anger, resentment that the pastor must harbor to take such an extreme step, removing my membership when I had only resigned from my position. It has become clear that the pastor of Santa Cruz BBC is unreliable of his words, at least in my case. Because he had previously assured me with statements like, "Bong, puli-puli ani mo ni Leonardo magtudlo sa YP, dugang ni siya nga worker sa church, or dili ni siya kompetensya," yet he proceeded to remove me from the directory without prior notice. Moreover, despite our last conversation where I had only confirmed my resignation from a position, he falsely informed the church that I had also resigned from my membership, which was never my intention. I am at a loss as to what had caused this shift in him. The pastor was once a great leader whom I admired deeply. In the past, he was patient and composed with his students and workers, primarily with Otis, Marvin, and Gilbert. He was warm and approachable, even when addressing the issues like the care of flowers, a task that often went neglected despite the presence of numerous workers. He would gently remind them to take the flowers up to the rooftop without losing his temper. However, these things changed after his first students and workers left to pursue their own ministries, and I was left to fill their roles. His demeanor toward me became noticeably colder. During my tenure, He would frequently become upset if I was late with the preparations or failed to move the flowers to the rooftop on time. Whether this change is due to age or some other factor, he is no longer the same leader as he was with Otis, Marvin, and Gilbert. He used to be a leader, but now he's just a boss. His warmth seemed to diminish, and while he remained somewhat distant, Mambiebing also displayed a degree of coldness, though I did not find that to be a significant issue. The arrival of Leonardo marked a shift where the pastor's warmth returned, but only toward Leonardo and not toward me. This became glaringly evident when Leonardo told me bluntly, "You are in the wrong place." It was at that moment I realized that I had been stranger there all along, that I am a stranger in a place where I had once grown up.